Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
The title of this conversation is The Heartbreaking Flood. Exclamation mark. We need to explain that, Mike. What flood and why is it heartbreaking?
We're going to be looking in this episode, David, at the story of the flood in the time of Noah. And why was it heartbreaking? Because it was the very last thing that God really wanted to do.
Fill in a little bit of the backstory, because when we were talking last time, we were talking about Cain and Abel and the first murder and the consequences for him and the generations that followed.
Yes, and one of the things we mentioned in that episode was that as the human race began to multiply in numbers and spread, there was this mixture of, on the one hand, the human race at its best, developing music and technology and family life, but also at its worst. And sadly, one of the things that we see happening, still today very often, the worst often triumphs over the best. And certainly that happens in these early chapters of Genesis. So by the time we come to Genesis chapter 6, we find that human wickedness is growing at such an extent that, here's one of the most heartbreaking verses actually in the Bible. Chapter 6 and verse 5 of Genesis says that the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. I'll just pause there for a moment. So it's both the actions and the attitudes. It's both what the human race does and what they are inclined to do, what they want to think, that is going downhill rapidly. And then we read this terribly sad verse that the Lord was grieved that he had made humankind on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. Wow, if that isn't a surprise, surely this is not where the story was meant to go. This wasn't what God had intended for the human race at the beginning, that the evil is becoming so great that God is wishing, putting it in our language, I wish I'd never made them. And his heart breaks. And here's one of the common pictures we get in the Bible. Sin breaks God's heart. It doesn't just break God's law. It doesn't just break his ways. It breaks his heart. Why? Because he knows what we are made for. He knows that we function best when we live life his way, when we follow the Maker's manual. When we don't, it breaks his heart because he knows it could be so different. So by the time we get to chapter 6, this terrible decline of the human race to the point where God's heart is broken at what he sees.
So it's almost as if God is saying enough is enough, but he could have said enough is enough before then. It's got to such a point where enough is enough.
Yeah, here's the grace of God, the kindness of God, the long-suffering of God, to use an old word, the patience of God. Again, we'll see that again and again in the Bible. God could so easily respond to the first sin by saying, that's it, enough, bang. But again and again, we'll see him giving people a long rope. Why? Because he wants them to learn. He wants them to change. And of course, it was possible because chapter 6 opens with, this rather strange reference to the sons of God and the daughters of men intermarrying. Now, some people have made a lot of that out of and turned it into stories which go back to some Jewish traditions, not biblical traditions, but Jewish cultural traditions and religious traditions, whereby fallen angels intermarried with the human race and produced this weird bunch of people called the Nephilim, who were sort of giants for those days. And most scholars wouldn't go that line these days. They would see simply this as being a Hebrew expression, the sons of God, meaning those who were godly, the daughters of men being those who were ungodly. There's what we call Hebrew parallelism there. Hebrew didn't use poetry, but it used parallel, balancing, contrasting word. Sons, daughters, God, men. So we get, yes, there are the godly still on earth, of whom Noah would be one. Yes, there are the ungodly, but the godly and the ungodly begin to intermarry, and what that nearly always leads to is that the ungodly element ends up prevailing, and that's certainly what happens here on the earth at this time.
God has decided to start again, and he could have done all sorts of different things, but he chooses Noah then to be part of this new plan.
Who knows what he could have done? But he chooses one person. It's interesting that we'll see this again and again in the Bible story. God often just picking out one person whom he will use. Usually nothing to do with that person as such, but to do with the grace of God. He'll pick Abraham, he'll pick Moses, he'll pick David, and through this he will work out his purpose. And that's what he does here. He chooses one person, and it's actually one person who in this case does stand out from the rest of the human race. Not because he's perfect, but because he's different in attitude. So in chapter 6 and verse 9, where the story of Noah begins, we read that Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. So pictures there, not of perfection, but of a man who is genuinely seeking to do the right thing, genuinely seeking to, here's this image, walk with God, have a relationship with God. And that was such a contrast to what was going on in the earth, because the very next verse goes on to tell us that the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. Oh my goodness, it's got even worse within just these few verses of the story. And God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So this man, Noah, stands out in such a stark contrast. He wants to walk with God. He wants relationship with God. He wants to live life God's way against this background of a corrupt world where people are doing wrong, living wrong, thinking wrong, acting wrong. And it's just getting worse and worse and worse to the point where, God, as you put it, wants to start with a clean slate, make a new beginning. And the way he will do that, of the many ways he could have done it, is to pick this one person had set his heart to seek to please God, the man called Noah.
It's hard to imagine what pressures Noah must have had around him in that world of depravity, by the sound of it.
I think it must have been incredible. I think, any of us who have been in a workplace scenario, whether it's the factory floor or the office or the school staff room or the science lab, will know how hard it is to maintain your Christian integrity when the language around you is foul, when the jokes are smutty, when the discussions about the boss are destructive and undermining. And as much as you want to make a stand and be different, it is really hard if you are the only person. Of course, when you do push through and when you make your stand, people will often, you might get made fun of to begin with, but people will often then respect you for the stand that you do make. But I think all of us can understand how incredibly hard it must be, and particularly for a godly man who's living in the world, as we've just read, that was corrupt and full of violence, to not be corrupt, to not follow their ways, to not accept the lie that, well, look, that's the only way you can survive. The only way you can survive here is by lying, cheating, stealing, wheeler dealing, like everybody else. You'll get trampled on if you don't. To be the one person who says, no, I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to do it God's way. I'm going to trust God. And of course, we see in this story, he's the one who will be vindicated.
Does it surprise you that God chose to flood the earth to start all over again?
It's a surprise in that this is God's beautiful creation. Go back to Genesis 1. Every single day of creation, every single aspect of his creation, God looks at it, and as he made it originally, it was good. The whole thing was very good. So it is a surprise that God will destroy what he has made. I suppose where it's not a surprise on the flip side is that this world was created not just for its own sake. It was created for a purpose, to be a home for human beings who would have relationship with him and carry out his purpose. So the greater impetus there of wanting a people who would fill the whole earth, who would know him, if you like, is the card that has to trump the other one. So at one level, a surprise, absolutely. At the other level, not a surprise, because God is so committed to this plan of having godly people who will know him, who will fill the whole earth one day, that it's worth all that will involve to bring something good out of it.
And again, just to sort of focus on God's methods, this ark with all the animals, I mean, that is a surprise.
It certainly is, isn't it? And why the ark? Because there's probably even a surprise back before that. Remember, this part of the Bible story is set in that part of the Middle East, in the whole area between the sort of Tigris-Euphrates regions, modern Iran, Iraq, that sort of area, that we know is exceedingly dry. It has very little rainfall. And, you know, the first surprise is God says, I'm going to make it rain and flood the whole earth. And I'm sure people are thinking, rain, what's rain? Flood, what's a flood? Let alone then what this crazy guy ends up doing, boat. What's a boat? Now, you know, they've probably seen boats if they were actually by the rivers. But for many of these people, even the idea of a boat, a floating boat, though, please don't let us think of Noah's Ark as we see in the pictures drawn of the children's Bible with its nice curved ends and its little house on top with its little roof. The Bible makes very clear that it was really simply a floating box, 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high, 3 internal floors, a door that sort of dropped down on one side where Adam and his family and the animals could come in and could then be closed, a gap at the top with a roof for air to come in. So the very idea of rain, a flood, a boat, certainly a boat of this size in the middle of desert, was not only a surprise, it was frankly stupid, and I'm sure the people around Noah must have been very quick to let him know that.
Interested how precise the dimensions are. It could have been any size, I suppose, but very precise.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because we often get this, like, think of the building of the tabernacle, the descriptions that God gives to Moses for the building of the tabernacle are incredibly precise. And I think this comes down to, you know, God is a God of detail. I mean, we know now when we look through microscopes and things, the incredible detail and construction of human cells and little tiny creatures and so on. God does care about the detail. And I think it's an expression of God caring. It's probably also an expression of God saying, are you prepared to do it my way? Remember, this is against a background of a world that doesn't want to do it God's way anymore. And so here is a little test as well. Noah, here's what I want you to do. I want you to make an ark, and it is to be this size. And would Noah do it God's way, particularly when God's way seemed, frankly, stupid? Still a challenge for us today, of course. Will we do things God's way? Will we do it the way God says, the way he says in his word, when the culture around us stands looking and saying, that is stupid, that is archaic, it just won't work in the modern world? And when those sort of arguments come against us, will we still do it God's way? Well, the story of Noah shows us that when we do, that's when we find God's blessing comes.
You said just now that God cares about the detail and that God is a caring God. I'm still struggling with the fact that the flood that's about to come is going to destroy the earth. And I'm just, in my mind, imagining babies, children, adults dying in this flood. How does a caring God fit into that?
Well, that is a big question, David, and is one that is often asked, not just about this story, but much wider, isn't it? If there is a God of love, then why is there so much suffering in the world? We have to acknowledge is still one of the biggest challenges against a belief in God or against the Christian faith that there is. And I certainly wouldn't want to be glib, and I would never want to be glib about it in particular situations. But the thing that the Bible shows us is, look, human beings make choices, and choices have consequences. And so very often what we see in the Bible, but still today, is people make choices that have consequences and then want to blame God for the consequences. Think of the global warming issues that we have today. It is tragic when we see the sort of fires that have raged over recent months and years, the sort of floods that we get when the innocent suffer. And it is incredibly painful for those who experience loss at such time. Whose fault is it? Now you could say, well, God could intervene. Well, yes, God could intervene if we all want to be robots and we want a robotic world where everything works a little bit like God pressing buttons on his computer in heaven and everything does everything right at every moment. That would mean you and I never had any choices to make ever again. We sadly make wrong choices, and people had made wrong choices about how they were living here. And I can't take away from the fact that there are hard things in this story, and yet they are the consequences of how people chose to live. And God's heart through it all was that there would be a better beginning. Remember, what we've seen is that the Lord was grieved by all of this. He's not sitting there in heaven even sitting thinking, it's your own stupid fault. He's grieved, and this drastic action is in order to bring about something better. Not just because he's sitting up there thinking of nasty things to dump on people.
The story of Noah and the flood and the ark also has the rainbow. Now, that's not just a happy ending, is it? What's the significance of that rainbow that we all love to see?
Yeah, right at the very end of the story, a surprise comes with the rainbow. Now, we are not meant to think that there weren't rainbows before this point. God seems to take something that already exists but infuses it with new meaning. So at the end of this long flood period, and perhaps we'll come back to that in the moment, when the whole flood is over and the waters have retreated, God makes what the Bible calls a covenant with Noah and all his descendants. Now, Noah and all his descendants therefore means everyone who lives today. So this is a covenant with the human race. God promises that he will never again flood the whole earth, with waters as he had done on that occasion, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. So God's under no illusions there. But as Noah and his family come out of the ark at the end of this flood, he gives them that same commission that he'd given to Adam and Eve, to go and be fruitful and fill the whole earth, and gives them this covenant sign, a sign of the rainbow. In fact, maybe I could just read those verses here from chapter 9. God says, "This is the sign of the covenant I'm making between you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I've set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I'll remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind." So it's not just a covenant with the human race, it's with creation itself. God says, never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. And God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant I've established between me and all life on earth." So as I said, we're not meant to think that God created rainbows out of nothing. We understand these days how rainbows occur. God is simply taking something that has existed but now gives it new meaning. The rainbow is a reminder that God has made this agreement, this binding covenant between himself and the human race, that he would never flood the earth again. And, I still love looking at rainbows. I'm not sure there's anyone ever looks at a rainbow and can't fail to be fascinated by it, even though, we might understand the science of why it is. But when you see a rainbow, particularly a full rainbow, and, it's glorious, and you see all its colours there and the full arc, there's something incredible about it. And there's something heart-stirring, I find, about it, to think, wow. But for me, that wow is always a reminder to think of, it's not just the covenant God made, but the heart that lies behind it. Here for me is a regular reminder of how God wants to bless the earth and how God wants to bless human beings on the earth. It's almost as if it's a regular poster board for God saying, hey, remember me? Don't forget me. I'm still here. I still want to bless you. And that's a very exciting reminder, I personally find.
I think as I heard you read the verses, does it say it was for God to remember?
Yes, that was an interesting one, wasn't it? It just impacted me again, even as I read it a few moments ago. So it serves as a reminder to us. It's a reminder to him. And I think covenants are always like that in the Bible when God makes a covenant with us. Of course, the ultimate covenant in the Bible is the covenant God makes with us through the Lord Jesus Christ and his death on the cross. And that serves to remind not only us of our sin and who has died for us, but it serves to remind God of why he does not need to punish us, because Christ has died in our place and we put our trust in him. So it's a reminder both ways. A reminder for God, not in the sense that he might forget. God is God. He never forgets anything, does he? So it's not like an aide-memoire, a piece of string tied round his finger to remind him, or a post-it note on his computer screen lest he forget. It serves as a constant reminder in the sense of, this is what I committed myself to do. Maybe more a pledge than a reminder might be a better word for us because of how we associate that word remembering. So this is God's permanent pledge. And he says, whenever I see it, yes, I will recall again. That is my pledge. And I will stand by it as God does with all his covenants.
God keeps his promises. maybe unlike us. And therefore, if he said that he will not do this again, that is to be trusted.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, we do see floods today, but this is a pledge that God will never flood the whole earth again. Maybe I should just pause at that point so we don't miss this. I use those words, they never flood the whole earth again. The Bible text does not require us to believe that the whole of the earth was covered with water. There's probably not enough water in the oceans and in the sky to actually do that. And the Bible doesn't require us to do that. Remember, at this point, the human race is still spread out in a very limited area in the Middle East. So all there is required is a flood sufficient to cover the whole known earth at that times. In fact, way back at the beginning of the 20th century, a very famous archaeologist by the name of Professor Woolley did very extensive surveys and found evidence of a massive regional flood back in sort of prehistory, as we might call it, reflecting this very story. The word that is used in the Hebrew text for earth is also used at times, we translate it as land. It's the Hebrew word eretz. It can mean land, it can mean earth. It's even the word that's used for the land of Israel, the Eretz Israel. So we don't have to think of the whole earth being covered. All we need to think of is a vast regional flood that covered the populated area in the Middle East to deal with the sin that was developing in the growing and developing human race. And remember, it's not until we get to chapter 11 and the Tower of Babel when the human race is scattered across the whole earth anyway. So, yeah, you can forget the ideas of this flood covering the whole earth. It covered, the text requires us to believe, the known earth at that time.
In conclusion, what's most surprising for you about this story, which we've called the heartbreaking flood?
Yeah, well, it is heartbreaking because I think the pain that God must have felt to have to destroy so much of what he had created, both the creation itself and human beings, must have deeply pained him. But he had to do it. Why? Because he was so grieved about the way that human beings were living and behaving and turning against good and godly values. So incredibly heartbreaking for him. But I suppose the big surprise that I'm left with, in a sense, it shouldn't be a surprise because God is always like this, is God always has a plan. And while this looks devastating, while it looks like, my goodness, what are you going to do through this? Through taking Noah and his family into the ark to avoid that flood, through taking all those pairs of animals that would be able to begin populating the earth along with the human race again, God here is showing the sort of God he is, a God who always has a plan. So here's the surprise. It's not the end of the story. He does have a plan. And through those days that Noah and his family would be in the ark, and by the way, not just 40 days, it was over a year that he was there. The rains fell for 40 days. The waters prevailed for 150 days. They then withdrew for another 150 days. It took another 70 days for the earth to dry up. So 370 days, this whole story is a pretty long time for Noah and his family to be in the ark with all those animals. I just hope they had big shovels is all that I could hope over that period. But the surprise for the human race was perhaps that God takes sin seriously and that judgment is something that's very real. But the greater surprise is that God always has a plan. And through Noah and his descendants, he will again be able to begin that plan of bringing forth a godly people who will fill the whole earth. So it was heartbreaking to God, heartbreaking for people who suffered in this story. But through it all, God's plan is worked out and furthered, as we'll see in coming episodes.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.